Hello, everybody. This is my racial autobiography, and wanted to give a little bit of background before I got started into it. Um, the initial assignment, when I was going to work on it as a paper, was going to be titled "White Boys Don't Play with Black Girls," and there is some significance to that title, which I would get into a little bit later. But it has to do with that first incident where I really felt racial tension, or where I felt like racial issues came into play in society. I want to get a little bit of background in before I move to that, to kind of lead up to that incident, which happened actually in my first grade year. I was born in 1971. And that was the year or two after Effingham County schools desegregated. Effingham County is where I grew up. I actually grew up in a small community called Meldrum, and it was in the southern end of the county, about 25 miles west of Savannah. Kind of had the quintessential Leave It to Beaver, I guess, childhood, or at least that's what all my friends would say. My parents lived next door to my grandparents, who lived next door to my great grandparents. A lot of my family were right there in that community. Most of my family had been in that town since the 1880s, 1890s, or at least close by. So, but anyway, I started school in the 1976-77 school year. At that time, Effingham County did not have kindergarten, so I had to attend a private half-day kindergarten about 12 miles away, in the next county. And it was, as far as I can remember, all white. I asked my mother about it, and as far as she could remember, it was all white. It was a small amount of kids, and it was just a real small program. So that was a half day, 1976 through 77. Um, I started Marlowe Elementary School, one of four elementary schools in the county, in the 1977-78 school year. And we had four sections per grade, and we were in tracked schooling. In other words, we were tracked by our IQ test and the initial testing that we did when we first got into schooling by the county. Effingham desegregated schools, like I said, in the 1969 to 1970 school year. I found an old clipping, newspaper clipping from the Effingham Herald, which was the local newspaper, that said on September 4th, 1969, schools began. It was the first total desegregation. I think they probably did a little bit of that grade per year type thing, or freedom of choice. Some of the things that went on in the counties to try to delay total desegregation of the schools. So, so 69-70 was the first year of desegregated schooling. I was in the first generation of students going to elementary school together, white and African American. Um, and so of course, I didn't know it at the time, and didn't know much about it at all until I started doing some research on it and asking my family about it. My aunt was actually in high school excuse me, in junior high whenever they desegregated schools. My mother and father had already graduated in '66, so they did not experience any form of or anything with the desegregation process. So, so anyway, getting back to my first racial encounter, um, kind of painting a picture first of first grade. We had those four sections, A, B, C, D. We were tracked, and what I thought the statistics for my county was more like 70% white, 30% African American. It actually wasn't that case. As I did the research and the statistics on the county, we ranged from 85-15, 85% white, 15% black, to 80% white, 20% black, depending on school and location. I grew up in a portion of the county that was even more predominantly white. So my first grade year in Marlowe Elementary was 90% white, 10% African American. As a matter of fact, um, in those track sections, I was really curious about this at one time to see how much the tracking and the race coincided. Just knowing what I know now about things, and the yearbook definitely illustrated that the idea of tracking and how most of the African American students were tracked in the lower tracked classes. So that was one aspect of it. Matter of fact, Section A had 32 students, and only one was African American. The class that I was in, which was B section in first grade, was 32 students, only one African American. And then the C class only had two African Americans, and then there were seven in the D class, which made up almost half the class. So tracking and race kind of went along together, unfortunately, which I think many of us know about the research that surrounds that. Um, so getting back to that incident, that was my first racial encounter. There was a young African American girl who had a crush on me in first grade. I liked her. We played on the playground, and that's when we had still a significant amount of recess. We sometimes had recess for 45 minutes. It was pretty good. Um, so we had recess. We played recess together. We ate our snacks together. We'd go to the lunchroom together. And there was this one incident where she and I were sitting on a root of one of those old 100-year-old oak trees on the playground. And three of my friends, all boys, came over to us, and in a very dominating stance, they stood over us because we were sitting on this root. And I think there was a fourth one there too, as well, as best I can recall, but he kind of stayed back a little bit. But they stood over us, and almost angrily, they looked at me, and I'm just going to say exactly what they said. They looked right at me and said, "Why you want to play with that nigger girl instead of us?" And it just took me aback. I could not believe what they had said. I didn't know how to handle it. And then they followed it up like, "Don't you know that white boys don't play with black girls?" And that was, of course, originally was going to be the title of my piece. So that was a wake up call. I didn't really know how to handle that. And when I sit there and think about that incident, I wish I could have handled it so much better than what I did. And I think not even so much the particular incident that happened that day, but the follow on to that, the fallout from that was I could not handle it, and I did not want to deal with it. And so the answer to that for me was, instead of standing up for her and approaching it a little bit better, but there again, I was 6 years old. I started avoiding her, and it got her very upset. And I remember I was doing everything I could to avoid this situation because I just wanted to be liked, and I didn't know how to handle it all. And I remember she and I ran into each other one day on the playground, and she came up to me first angrily why I was avoiding her, and I just didn't know what to say. I just stared at her, and then she got upset and started crying and asked why I didn't want to play with her anymore and why I didn't like her anymore, and I still wouldn't answer her. And she just turned around and ran off, and then we never really talked to each other anymore. And that episode still haunts me to this day, that I just couldn't handle it any better. I mean, I know I was young. So, but a little bit more about the background. Like I said, schooling was the most significant aspect of my life then. 4 elementary schools in the county. The whole county came together in junior high, which was the actual former African American high school. And then by the time I got to the high school, we were roughly 80%, 20%, 80% black, 20% white. 80% white, 20% black. And but there were other things that went along with high school. And my high school was the Effingham County High School Rebels. and it was the Confederate rebel. So when you came to our school, you saw Confederate flags, Confederate soldiers, um, very white. The faculty was very white. The On Friday night football game nights, if you drove down Highway 119 in Effingham County, Georgia, you thought you were going to a Klan rally. There were African Americans there, but we all wanted to pretend like it wasn't a problem at the football games or a problem within the community. Um, but I'm sure it was. I know that news crews started coming in and talking about this and why we were still the way we were at the time. Um, but um, but yeah, Friday night football games. We played Dixie when we made touchdowns. The band was called the Rebel Regiment. We had Confederate soldiers at the beginning of the game. A guy dressed up in a Confederate soldier uniform on a horse would ride into the stadium and plant a Confederate flag right on the 50-yard line. And we were playing schools from Savannah like Beach High School and Johnson High School and predominantly African American high schools. And I just didn't even think about the significance of that at the time because it just is what it was. It was how it was. Um, there were incidences in my community as well, but in general, I grew up from a very conservative Southern background. My I had family members that still use the N word when they referred to African Americans. There were three African American men that worked for my great grandparents, and she still referred to them as my great grandmother still referred to them as the boys and would not let them come in her house. And they had to refer to me as Mr. Jamie. I'm sitting there, and thinking back on that, being 6 and 7 and 8 years old, and you got 30-year-old grown men having to refer to me as Mr. Um, so growing up in rural South Georgia, um, definitely, aided in how I viewed the world. And it wasn't until, getting to a couple of the other questions that we have for this assignment, looking at how these experiences have helped shape my racial awareness and how might those experiences of my racial being affect me as a researcher. It wasn't really until I started working on my master's degree at the University of Georgia when I started surrounding myself with folks that thought a little bit more critically about race and gender and class and digging into these situations, utilizing critical race theory and probably even not even more so. I didn't realize this until I started working on my doctorate degree in the fall of 2013. Um, my professor at the time, which was also the department chair for educational theory and practice, Dr. Ron Bouchard, I took a history of African American education class, and that's when I really started digging into this, really started examining why it is the way I think about things, the situations that have happened in my past, going up through schooling the way I did, the way my family thought about things, um, you know, really analyzing my background in, what it means to be part of the dominant group and how a dominant racial group treats a minority group, regardless of what group it is. You know, coming to terms with my past and the way I was raised, that's been a significant portion of my studies and how I think now. Um, and trying to speak on that in a short video segment is really hard to do, but it I definitely was impacted by events ever since from that first grade on. So that's just a little bit of a taste of what really started defining me as a racial being and making me come to realize that I was a racial being. Um, so anyway, thanks for the time and take care.